I was 20 years old, sitting on a bench outside a bus station in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with $43 in my pocket, a garbage bag full of clothes at my feet, and a baby growing inside me that I had known about for exactly 11 days. The man who was supposed to love me had packed his things and left while I was at work. He didn't leave a note. He didn't leave a phone number. He left a half-empty box of cereal on the counter and a door that didn't lock properly, and a silence so complete that when I came home and called his name, the echo of my own voice was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. My name is Sarah Calloway, and this is my story. I grew up in a small town in rural Arkansas called Mena, population just under 6,000. My mother worked double shifts at a diner 6 days a week and still couldn't keep the lights on half the time. My father left when I was 4, and I have no memories of him that aren't constructed from a single photograph my grandmother kept on her dresser. A man in a plaid shirt squinting into the sun, looking like he's already thinking about somewhere else he'd rather be. I was the oldest of 3 kids. I learned to cook at 9. I learned to stretch a box of pasta into 3 meals at 11. I learned that the world does not slow down for you just because things are hard. I graduated high school with decent grades and no plan. I couldn't afford a college. There were no scholarships waiting for me, no guidance counselor pulling me aside to talk about my future. I moved to Tulsa at 18 because a girl I knew from church had an apartment there and said she could get me a job at the restaurant where she worked. I got the job. I lost the apartment 6 months later when the girl moved back home and I couldn't cover the full rent on my own. I found a cheaper place. I found a boyfriend named Derek who seemed kind at first and then seemed less kind as the months went on, and then one day stopped seeming like anything at all because he was simply gone. And so, there I was, 20 years old, pregnant, $43, a bench outside a bus station. I sat on that bench for 3 hours. I didn't cry. I had done my crying already, the night before, when I had finally let the reality of the situation land on me fully. The weight of it, the specific heaviness of being completely alone in a way that has no bottom to it. By the morning I was past crying. I was in the part that comes after crying, which is quieter and in some ways worse, because it's the part where you actually have to decide what you're going to do. I thought about calling my mother. But my mother had nothing to give me. She was already stretched past her limit, and I knew that showing up on her doorstep pregnant and broke would not solve my problem. It would only add my problem to hers. And I had been watching her carry other people's weight my entire life, and I had promised myself at age 12 that I would never be another thing she had to carry. I thought about the $43. I thought about what it could buy and what it couldn't, and how long it would last. Not long. Not long at all. And then I thought about a recruiter I had walked past 3 times in the past month. A woman in a neat uniform, sitting behind a small table outside the mall, handing out brochures, looking like she had somewhere to be and a reason to be there. I had never stopped. I had always kept walking. But I had always noticed her, in the way you notice something that is meant for you even when you're not ready for it. I picked up my garbage bag. I got on a bus. I rode it to the mall. And I walked up to the recruiting table and I said, I need to know everything. The recruiter's name was Sergeant First Class Diane Okafor. She was 34 years old. She had served 12 years in the United States Army. She had 2 kids of her own and a husband who worked in logistics, and a laugh that started in her chest and filled whatever room she was in. She looked at me, really looked at me, the way very few people had ever looked at me. And she asked me 2 questions. The first was, are you serious? The second was, are you okay? I told her I was serious. I told her I was not entirely okay, but that I was working on it. I told her I was pregnant, and I needed to know if that changed anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it changes the timeline. It doesn't change the door. I enlisted 6 months after my daughter was born. Her name is Grace. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and she came into the world at 3:17 in the morning in a hospital in Tulsa, with no father in the waiting room, and a nurse named Betty, who held my hand through the last 2 hours, and told me I was doing great, even when I was fairly certain I was not doing great at all. I was 20 years old, and I was a mother, and I was alone, and I had never in my life felt so terrified and so certain about anything at the same time. My mother drove up from Arkansas to take Grace while I went to basic training. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, handing my daughter to someone else and stepping onto a bus to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, watching her face get smaller through the window. I told myself I was doing it for her. I told myself that every time it got hard, which was often, because basic training has a very specific talent for finding exactly the thing you think you cannot do, and making you do it anyway over and over, until you stop believing it is impossible and start believing something else instead. I discovered something at Fort Jackson that nobody had ever told me about myself. I was good at this. Not just adequate, not just getting by. I was genuinely, naturally good at the structure and the discipline and the physical demands and the mental pressure of military training. My drill sergeant, a man named Staff Sergeant Briggs, who communicated almost exclusively through controlled fury, pulled me aside in the 6th week and told me, in language I will not repeat here, that I had the makings of a real soldier. Coming from Staff Sergeant Briggs, this was roughly equivalent to receiving an honorary degree. I graduated basic training in the top 15% of my company. I went on to advanced individual training as a military police officer. I was good at that too. I had a calm under pressure that my instructors noted repeatedly, an ability to stay level when the situation was demanding that you panic, to think clearly in the space where most people stopped thinking and started reacting. I didn't know where it came from. Looking back now, I think it came from a childhood spent managing chaos. When you grow up learning to stretch pasta into 3 meals and keep younger siblings fed and calm in a house where the electricity might go out at any time, you develop a relationship with unpredictability that other people don't have. You stop being afraid of it. You start managing it. I did 2 years as a military police officer at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I was promoted to specialist, then to corporal. I sent money home to my mother every month for Grace's care. I called every Sunday morning and Grace would get on the phone and say Mama and I would press the phone against my ear as hard as I could, like I could get closer to her that way. She learned to walk while I was at Fort Campbell. She said her first full sentence while I was at Fort Campbell. I missed those things. I carry that. I will always carry that. But I also know that what I was building during those years was the foundation of everything she has now, and I have made my peace with that trade, even though the peace is not perfect, and probably never will be. I applied for officer candidate school at 24. My commanding officer at the time, a captain named Morrison, who wore his skepticism openly and earned it back slowly, told me I was reaching. I told him I understood his concern. Then I submitted my application anyway. I was accepted on my 2nd attempt. I attended OCS at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I graduated as a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Army at 25 years old, with my daughter in the audience in a dress my mother had sewn by hand, clapping so hard that the woman next to her asked if she was all right. I met James at Fort Benning. He was a 1st lieutenant in the infantry, stationed there for a training rotation. He was from Georgia, a small town called Bainbridge, same size as Mina, same flat sky, same sense that the world was wide and you had to go find your piece of it. He had a quietness about him that I recognized immediately, the quietness of someone who has learned that most things don't require commentary, that presence is often more useful than words. We dated for 8 months. We were engaged for 4. We were married in a ceremony at the base chapel with Grace as our flower girl, age 5, deeply serious about her responsibilities, scattering petals with the focus of someone diffusing ordnance. James understood what my career meant to me. He had his own career, and his own ambitions, and his own sense of what service meant, and we built our life around two people who both had something to give, and were committed to the work of giving it. There were hard years. There were deployments, and separations and phone calls at strange hours, and the particular loneliness of being married to someone who is very far away. There was Grace growing up between two parents, who were often not in the same place, and handling it with a grace that justified her name completely. There was the work, always the work, the promotions, the commands, the evaluations, the decisions that kept coming faster and with more weight as the years went on. I was promoted to captain at 28, to major at 33, to lieutenant colonel at 38. Each promotion came with more responsibility and more visibility and more of the specific pressure that comes with being a woman in an institution that was not built for women and has been accommodating us only gradually and not always gracefully. I faced it. I did not always handle it perfectly. But I did not stop moving forward, because stopping was never something I had learned how to do. I was 40 years old when I received my first star. Brigadier General Sarah Calloway. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon. James was in the front row in his dress uniform. He had made colonel by then, a fact that made me prouder than any promotion of my own. Grace was beside him, 20 years old now, a sophomore at Georgetown studying international relations, tall and poised and looking at me with an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. My mother was there too, 71 years old, in a blue dress she had bought specifically for this day and had been talking about for 6 months. The morning of the ceremony, James brought me coffee in our hotel room. He set it on the nightstand, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at me for a long moment. And then he said, very quietly, in the voice he uses only for the things that matter most, "Good morning, General." I had been keeping it together all morning. I had been professional and composed and focused the way I had trained myself to be for 20 years. And those 3 words, those 3 quiet, simple words from the man who had watched me become this, and chosen to stand beside it every step of the way. Those words were the ones that finally broke through everything. I cried. I am not embarrassed to say it. I cried the way you cry when something you fought for with everything you had finally arrives, and you realize that you actually believed in it all along, even in the moments when believing felt like the most irrational thing in the world. I cried the way I had not let myself cry on that bench outside the bus station 20 years before, when I had $43 and a garbage bag and a decision to make. I made the right decision. There are people who will tell you that your circumstances define your ceiling, that where you start determines where you finish, that some doors are not for you. I sat on a bench at 20 years old with nothing, and I have spent the last 2 decades proving, one day at a time, that those people are wrong. Not because I am exceptional, but because I was willing to keep moving when moving was the hardest thing I could imagine doing. If you are sitting on your bench right now, if you are in the part that comes after crying, the quiet part, the part where you have to decide, I want you to know something. The decision is the beginning, not the result, not the destination. The moment you decide to stand up and keep moving, something shifts. Something that was closed starts to open. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly over years, in small increments that don't feel like progress until one morning, someone you love looks at you across a hotel room and says 2 words that contain 20 years of everything you chose to become. Get up. Keep moving. The door is there. People ask me sometimes what the hardest moment was. Not the hardest deployment, not the hardest promotion board. The hardest moment? Full stop. And my answer surprises them, because it isn't any of the military moments at all. The hardest moment was a Tuesday evening in October, when Grace was 7 years old, and I had just returned from a 14-month deployment to Afghanistan, and she looked at me from across the kitchen, and I could see in her eyes that she was not entirely sure how to be comfortable around me yet. She knew I was her mother. She knew she loved me. But 14 months is a long time when you are 7, and the woman standing in her kitchen was both completely familiar and slightly strange, and she didn't know what to do with that, and neither did I. We sat at the kitchen table together, and I asked her to tell me about school, and she told me about her teacher and her best friend, and a project she had done on butterflies. And slowly over the course of that evening, the distance between us closed. Not completely. It took weeks for it to close completely. But that evening, sitting at the kitchen table listening to her talk about butterflies, was the moment I understood the full cost of the choice I had made. Not the price I had paid, but the price she had paid. Quietly and without complaint, because she was my daughter and she had my stubbornness and my refusal to make things harder for the people around her. I told her that night after dinner that I was sorry for every day I had missed. She looked at me very seriously. She has always been serious, Grace, in the way that children who grow up around adults become serious. And she said, "Mom, you are doing important things, I know that." And I thought, this child is going to be extraordinary. I was right. She is. James and I have been married for 15 years now. We have had the kind of marriage that requires work. Not because we don't love each other, but because love alone has never been enough to run a household, raise a child, manage 2 military careers, survive repeated separations, and maintain a genuine partnership between 2 people who both have strong opinions about almost everything. We have argued. We have misunderstood each other. We have had evenings where the distance between us felt enormous, and mornings where it felt like nothing at all. We have chosen each other, over and over, in the small daily ways that don't make for dramatic stories, but are the actual substance of a life together. He made Brigadier General himself, 2 years after me. The morning of his ceremony, I brought him coffee and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Good morning, General." He laughed. It was a good morning. I think about Sergeant First Class Diane Okafor often. The woman at the recruiting table who asked me 2 questions and meant them both. I tracked her down 7 years ago. She had retired by then, living in San Antonio with her family, coaching a youth soccer team on weekends. I called her on a Thursday afternoon and told her who I was and what she had done for me and where I was now. There was a silence on the line. Then she said, "I remember you. I always remembered you. You had that look." I asked her what look. She said the look of someone who just needed someone to tell them the door was open. Some people need more than that. You just needed the door. She was right. I just needed the door. I have tried, in every position I have held since, to be that for someone else. To be the person who looks at the young soldier or the young officer who has the look, the one who just needs to be told the door is open, and to tell them clearly and without hesitation, the door is open. Walk through it. Whatever brought you here, whatever you left behind to get here, whatever you are carrying that nobody else can see, none of it closes the door. The door is open, and on the other side of it is everything you are capable of becoming, which is more than you currently believe. I know this because I was 20 years old on a bench with $43 and a decision to make, and I made it. And 20 years later, the man I love looked at me across a hotel room on the best morning of my professional life and said 3 words that contained everything. "Good morning, General. If you believe that the people who rise from nothing and refuse to stay there deserve to be heard, subscribe to USA Valor Stories. We are here every single day with the stories that remind you what human beings are capable of when they decide to keep moving. These are the stories that never made the headlines, but they are the ones that matter most.